This is Trump on Earth. I'm Kara Holsapple. If you'd like to be reminded how President Trump feels about climate change, you need look no further than the United Nations Climate Action Summit in New York this week. That's where the world's leaders met to reaffirm their commitments to the Paris Climate Agreement and to cutting global emissions. Here's what UN Secretary Antonio Guterres said ahead of the summit.
And what I want is to have the whole of society putting pressure on governments to make governments understand they need to run faster because we are losing the race.
President Trump popped in for all of 14 minutes and made no formal remarks. He just said this.
I'm a big believer in clean air and clean water, and all countries should get together and do that, and they should do it for themselves. Very, very.
Compare that with the remarks of 16-year-old Greta Thunberg, who brought the world to its knees with her speech.
For more than 30 years, the science has been crystal clear. How dare you continue to look away and come here saying that you're doing enough when the politics and solutions needed are still nowhere in sight?
The Swedish activist recently said she doesn't think she can convince Trump and other climate change doubters that global warming is real. But she hopes they'll take briefings from actual scientists and experts in this area. But Trump openly questions climate science.
Well, first of all, I'm not a believer in global warming. I'm not a believer in man-made global warming. It could be warming.
He regularly mocks the idea of climate change, especially when it's cold outside.
And by the way, it's supposed to be 70 degrees today. It's freezing here. Speaking of global warming, we need some global warming. It's freezing. Man.
Remember when he called climate change a hoax and a concept created by the Chinese?
This whole global warming hoax, one of the great things, and it's not the hoax doesn't bother me if it didn't mean anything.
Now, what do you mean hoax?
Well, it's a hoax. I think the scientists are having a lot of fun.
He certainly made it clear he's not a believer.
I'm not denying climate change, but it could very well go back. We're talking about over millions of years. They say that we had hurricanes that were far worse than what we just had with Michael.
Who says that? They say. You mean the
people
people on the phone?
People say that in the...
Yeah, but what about the scientists who say it's worse than ever?
Trump is an outlier here. Most people around the world do think climate change is real and accept the idea that humans are at least partly responsible. But a survey of 28 countries released this month found that the United States has the highest proportion of climate deniers. 15% of Americans hold views that contradict the overwhelming scientific consensus on climate change. So how do you change the minds of climate deniers and people who doubt the scientific process in general? A philosopher we spoke with recently has some ideas. Lee McIntyre has written books about defending science and fighting back against alternative facts. He's been out on the road talking to flat earth theorists and people who don't accept current climate science. And we talked about what he's been learning. Thanks for coming in.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
So what are some of the myths about science that climate deniers and others use to defend their points of view?
I think that some of the myths that people have about science are not just ones that climate change deniers have, but really all science deniers. And one is that scientists have to achieve certainty, that they have to prove their results. Otherwise, they're not worth believing, and any theory is as good as any other. So you'll sometimes hear people say about evolution that evolution is just a theory. With climate change, people tend to say things like, well, you can't prove it. We don't have all the evidence. Let's wait until more evidence comes in. It's part of the same myth. It's this idea that until you have 100% certainty, nothing is worth believing. And that's just not how science works.
So how can scientists and others combat those myths?
I think that one thing that scientists can do is just embrace the idea of uncertainty. Every scientist actually knows that they can't prove their result. As much as they're trying to get as high on the probability spectrum as they can, they understand that with any empirical endeavor, there's always the possibility that more evidence will come in and change the theory. Look when Newton got overthrown for Einstein. No matter how well ensconced your theory is, there's always the possibility of future evidence. Scientists know this, but somehow when they're defending science to the lay public, they want to oversimplify, and they seem to want to say, well, no, this has been proven, or we know this. And that's deadly, because then if a science denier or a critic of science figures out that, no, there's actually this one piece of evidence that you haven't accommodated, or this other study, then they look bad. So my theory is that scientists just need to embrace the idea of uncertainty and talk about what they really believe, which is the idea of warrant. You believe things based on how strong the evidence is. There are always error bars, but that doesn't mean that you don't have evidence for what you believe.
Is it a question of scientific literacy? How can scientists communicate that to lay people?
I think examples are one good way to do it. Stories about how science works, not just always speaking in the abstract. I'll give you an example. Just about 5 or 6 months ago, Reuters reported that the evidence for climate change was now, for anthropogenic climate change was now at the 5 sigma level, which means that there's a 1 out of a million chance that it's not human caused. I think that people understand that.
So from what you've learned, is there sort of a way forward to understanding climate denial and then possibly changing minds?
I think that we need to change the way that we talk about it. I think that hitting people over the head with facts, making them feel stupid, causes them to shut down. People can actually change their mind based on facts. There's now been some empirical work on this. There was a terrific study out of Germany that appeared in Nature in June 2019 that talked about science deniers, or at least the audience for science deniers, changing their mind based on presentation of facts. But it depends on how you do it. I think that face-to-face is the way to do it. I think that people, if you read the literature about how people actually do change their mind, it's always on the basis of somebody that they trust. It's always on the basis of an encounter with a human being who takes their doubts seriously and talks them through it. And so one thing that I've been experimenting with as I've been having these conversations with science deniers and with others around these topics is how to assess what it is that people care about, because I think that that's actually the route to changing people's mind. There are well-known cases. The one that's the most fun for me is Jim Bridenstine, who President Trump appointed to be the chief administrator at NASA. Bridenstine was a climate change denier when he was in Congress.
Without objection, the gentleman from Oklahoma is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, global temperatures stopped rising 10 years ago. Global temperature changes, when they exist, correlate with sun output and ocean cycles. During the medieval warm period from 800
he was only at NASA for, I think, a few weeks before he changed his mind on climate change, which was amazing.
Administrator Bridenstine, thank you for being here. Do you believe that greenhouse gases are the primary cause of climate change?
Yes, the National Climate Assessment that includes NASA, and it includes the Department of Energy, and it includes NOAA, has clearly stated that it is extremely likely, is the language they use, it's extremely likely that human activity is the dominant cause of global warming, and I have no reason to doubt the science that comes from that.
Is it fair to call this an evolution of your views?
Yes.
And he wrote an account of this, how he did it, and it was based on his conversations with NASA scientists. He knew the evidence was out there, he could see it before, but it was when he met the people, he got to know them, he got to trust them, that's when he changed his mind. That's what I think actually works, and there's not a lot of empirical literature to back me up. It's mostly anecdotal, which is kind of ironic considering what I do, but I'm out there trying to see if it's possible to gather some empirical evidence on the road for this being the way that people change their mind.
Here's what I'll tell you from my perspective. We need to make sure that NASA is continuing to do this science, and we need to make sure that the science is void and free from partisan or political kind of rhetoric.
A new CBS poll shows that 2/3 of Americans now say that climate change is a crisis or a problem, and more than half say it has to be addressed now. Though more people are paying attention, although if you dig deeper into the poll, you find that 48% of respondents thought that there was a disagreement among experts that the main cause of climate change is humans. So are scientists and the media doing a better job about talking about climate change, and what's the media's responsibility?
That's a great question. I think one thing is just to cover it. The media has not spent nearly enough time on climate changes in proportion to the threat that it represents. I think that there could just be a lot more on this. Partially that's because it's long term, and people, maybe the media and the audience, are not so good about hearing about things that are long term. The other thing is, I think that a number of media outlets have made a very good decision these days not to do those sorts of false equivalence debates that they used to do, where you'd have Jim Hansen, who's kind of the voice of reason on climate change on one side, the scientist, and then somebody who's a denier who maybe has a website on the other, split screen, equal time, and then, well, it's controversial, you decide. That's itself a kind of bias. And those sorts of debates, that way of covering science, was quite common until fairly recently for climate change. And now there are some media outlets, I think the BBC is one, and I think there are several others that will not have climate change deniers on anymore because it is no longer a scientific debate. If people are having trouble believing what the scientists say, maybe that's a political debate, but it's not a scientific debate, and that's not the way that it should be covered.
So the media is maybe caught up a little bit on climate change, or it's catching up on the immediacy of the problem?
I think they are. I mean, we just had that 7-hour debate on CNN on climate change, and I think that's wonderful that they're doing that sort of coverage. I have to say that, though, in particular, I think they may have turned people off by having so much coverage all at once. I'd rather see them spread the coverage out a little bit rather than doing it all in one slug.
That was where the 10 Democratic candidates for president were talking about their climate change plans.
Yeah, and I forget how many there were at that point, but they I mean, at least they're covering it, but I think there are better ways to cover it.
I admit I didn't watch the whole thing.
I did not either. And if I didn't, I don't know who did. Because
right, we're the target audience here.
That's right.
Your book, Post-Truth, talks about how science is under attack. And I was just thinking about the president of the United States claiming, contrary to the National Weather Service forecast, that Alabama was in the path of a hurricane. And then the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Association supported that against the evidence, backed up his claim.
Yeah.
So I was just thinking, are we in a new phase of post-truth, or is this an example of something that's in line with what you've seen before, or a trend?
I think that there's actually a very interesting relationship between science denial and post-truth. Science denial, I mean, technically, I guess it goes back to Galileo and even before. In the modern era, if you read Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway's book, Merchants of Doubt, they talk about how modern science denial started with denial over the link between cigarette smoking and cancer in the 1950s. That really created a blueprint that was used for all sorts of science denial for the next 70 years. And I think what happened is a number of people noticed that was a very effective campaign. I mean, maybe you and I and a lot of NPR listeners are not going to think that was effective, but it was extremely effective to deny climate change, to deny evolution, acid rain, ozone, all sorts of things. And I think that caught the attention of some politicians who said, if you can deny the truth about cigarette smoking and cancer, if you can deny the truth about acid rain and ozone and all sorts of other things, what else can you deny the truth about? Maybe how many people were at an inauguration? Maybe the path of a hurricane? So that creates disrespect for truth. And it ends up having this metastasis to our larger culture where all of a sudden, not just scientific facts, but all facts, all evidence is up for political debate. The point of my book, Post-Truth, I define post-truth as the political subordination of reality, all reality. The example that you brought up about the path of Hurricane Dorian, I think that's a perfect example of post-truth. The evidence says this. It didn't suit the political narrative, so changed it in a sort of a ham-fisted way. This is the other insidious part. Post-truth isn't necessarily about convincing somebody. It's about dominating their reality. It's this idea that I can mark up a NOAA map and you can't do anything about it. And a lot of people are going to believe it. And so that might as well be reality. So don't bother me with your facts.
But you are out here trying to change minds about climate change. You're a philosopher, though. Why did you want to step outside of the academy and research and talk about these kinds of issues like climate denial with people face to face?
It is an unusual career path. So I've been a scholar in the philosophy of science for the last 20 years, and I've always been fascinated with the difference between science and non-science, just kind of, as all philosophers of science are, figuring that out. And what I realized was that science was really under assault. It was no longer just an academic question, what was scientific and what wasn't, but that science was being attacked. And I thought that philosophers really owed it to the field, owed it to the public to try to have a voice in this. But really very few of them were. And so I got interested in this and started to write about it. When I wrote Post-Truth, I went out on the road and did a book tour and got some press and did some talks. And in the Q&A, I kept getting asked the question, what can we do? What can we do? So you've convinced me. Maybe they were convinced already, but what can we do? And my advice was engage, talk to people, have the difficult conversations. Don't just sit back and let people get away with saying things that are false. Challenge them. And then I thought, why am I not doing more of that? Why am I going to these red states but speaking in the blue bubble where people have invited me to come, and I'm not necessarily convincing people? So at that point, I actively started to pursue speaking with science deniers, and dipped my toe in the water in November 2018 when I paid the fare and bought the ticket to go to the Flat Earth Convention in Denver. And I spent 2 days there with 600 flat earthers. And the first day I was completely quiet. I just listened to what they had to say. But the second day, I kind of came out as a philosopher. And I didn't try to change their mind with evidence, because the evidence has been around since Aristarchus. 2,300 years of evidence, they still don't believe it. I'm probably not going to convince them. What I did was, as a philosopher, try to challenge their reasoning strategy, the basis in conspiracy theories, inconsistencies. And I asked him a very tough question, which wasn't mine, but this is a philosophical question. What evidence would it take to convince you that you were wrong? So, if somebody maintains that their views based on evidence, the great philosopher Karl Popper said, then they have to say what would convince them, what would rule their view out. Flat earthers could not answer that. And I took that as a bit of a victory, because although I didn't convince them to the point where they said, my God, you're right, and tore off their lanyard and walked out with me, I think I did begin to plant the seed of doubt. I started there because I think that all science denial is basically the same. And I thought that this would be the kind of the test lab, the easiest case to study. And once I'd studied what Flat Earth was about, then I could go out and use those same techniques against vaccine deniers, climate change deniers, where the stakes were a little higher. The Flat Earthers aren't really hurting anybody, though the movement's growing. But climate change and vaccine deniers are hurting people. And I wanted to learn from the Flat Earthers what to say.
You were at a conference with 600 people. I don't know how many people are actually climate change deniers, and or some people who just don't understand or don't maybe care, or some people aren't paying attention. So, how important is it to engage with climate change deniers to try and change their thinking? Why not just move on to sort of a more middle ground and sort of try to convince those people to take action?
You raise a really good point there. One strategy that scientists use when their work is denied is to present the facts, and then if the person doesn't accept it, they walk away. Say, you're not worth talking to, you're not a rational person. But the thing that I realized in the course of my own research is that every lie has an audience. Every piece of misinformation has an audience. And that if you don't stand up to the person who's misrepresenting the facts, who's telling the lie, and maybe it's not a lie, maybe they believe it, but the point is, if you don't stand up for what what's actually not only true, but the process by which true beliefs are formed, there's going to be a whole extra generation coming up behind them. So the good example at the Flat Earth Convention, I took one of the presenters just after he'd come off stage to talk to him about something that he'd said that I thought was mistaken. I'm never going to convince him. He's a professional at this. He goes around and speaks at conferences. He makes money on this. I'm never going to convince him. But we drew a crowd, and I don't know how many people in that crowd listening to us talk might have been convinced. So I think that it's important to fight back against science denial, even if all I'm doing is inoculating the audience against science denial. So I'm out there, I'm meeting with people, and it's sometimes uncomfortable. It's not a comfortable thing to be the only person in the room who believes something. It's just the psychological pressure can be quite great, but I think it's important to do.
Well, thank you for talking with me face-to-face.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Lee McIntyre is a research fellow at the Center for Philosophy and History of Science at Boston University, and he's a lecturer in ethics at Harvard Extension School. His most recent book is called The Scientific Attitude. Thanks for listening to Trump on Earth. If you like our show, please consider supporting us through Patreon. Just go to patreon.com/TrumpOnEarth. That's Patreon, Patreon. You can find us online at TrumpOnEarth.org and anywhere you get your podcasts. Write us a review and tell your friends. This podcast is supported by the Robert F. Schuman Foundation. Our producer and digital editor is Andy Cubis. Kathy Nauer is the executive producer. I'm Carol Holsapple. See you next time.